I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here to speak, and to all of you for showing up at this early hour. So today I'll be talking about how computers can DNA map crime scenes by dreaming of electric peaks. I'll be using as a running example a gang crime case that I'm working on. I've changed some of the details for anonymization. So this crime starts off as a gang is formed and visits a county. They come in and they raid a food mart, and they leave behind a hat and a gun with DNA on it. They continue doing crimes, and they then, as they escalate their crimes, the violence starts going up. They learn from their crimes that maybe you've got to beat the witnesses up, you don't let them run away. And so they start getting more violent. They leave evidence at a hardware store. They leave more DNA at a jewelry store. And so this is the escalation of the crimes as they move through the county. And I'm going to show you a video that's pretty representative of what these crimes are looking like in this county.
4 suspects stormed into the terrifying jewelry store on Buford Highway just before noon on Tuesday. Surveillance video shows customers and clerks cowering to the floor in fear for their lives. One customer was hit in the head by one of the suspects with a pistol. Gwinnett County Police said the man was treated at the hospital for a minor injury. Police are asking for anyone with information about the robbery to call them or Crime Stoppers at 404-577-TIPS.
So as you can see, the violence is escalating, and they are visiting more and more crime scenes. And as they're going, they're leaving keys, hats, guns, different items of evidence that have DNA on it. So what is in this DNA evidence? Well, all of this DNA evidence is low-level mixtures, usually with 3 or 4 people in them. So let me quickly describe what a mixture is, so I can describe to you later how they get solved. So the DNA evidence are genotypes, and on the x-axis you see allele size of the SDRs, with the number of alleles, 13, 14, and so on, increasing, and the y-axis is showing the amount. Genotypes are made up of allele pairs, and so there's maybe a first contributor with genotype 13, 14. That's the major contributor. Another contributor shown in green that has a lesser amount with an allele pair of 16, 18, and a third contributor with less DNA with an allele pair shown in orange of 17, 20. So this is what's in the tube. This is what's left on the sample, and we're trying to understand. So the crime lab develops STR data, and on the x-axis, again, you see the size of the DNA fragments that correspond to the allele lengths of the short tandem repeats, the STRs, and the y-axis is showing the RFU values, the relative frequency units, and you can see that the data is pretty faithfully corresponding to the quantities of DNA that are present from the 3 different contributors, and shown in blue, green, and orange again are the peaks that might be corresponding to the underlying genotypes in the evidence. So the laboratory processed this evidence. There were 12 items that we received for TrueAllele interpretation at Cybernetics. From the 5 different scenes, again, you see guns, hats, safes, phones, different surfaces and samples that, if you know from your experience with this kind of evidence, are not going to give you pristine single-source data. There were also 10 reference items from 5 victims at these various scenes, as well as 5 suspects, individuals who were believed to be members of the gang. So imagine that your lab is confronted with this. You have 12 items of evidence. They're low-level 3 or 4 contributor mixtures. You have 10 different references, so 12 times 10. You have 120 match comparisons that you'd have to make. In this case, the lab didn't bother. They just sent it to us. And we received all the evidence items first and processed them in the computer, inferring genotypes, and then afterwards made the comparisons. The human review, as I said, produced no results, and one of the main reasons is the use of thresholds, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. A line is drawn, shown in red, where above the threshold, the data peaks are treated as if they have equal status or equal heights, and below the threshold, the data vanishes. It's not visible, it's not there, and it's just not used. So, for example, individuals having genotypes with peaks that are under the threshold would not have that data applied. However, computers can dream about electric peaks. They can dream on for days. And the way it works is this, and this is what TrueAllele does as a statistical program. You begin with the data. Here we're looking at about 6 peaks, and the data never changes. We don't apply thresholds, but instead we understand that that data came from somewhere. And in order to explain that data, the computer tries out almost every combination of different allele pairs as genotype values for the different contributors. It tries out different amounts, mixing weights. It considers stutter, relative amplification, degraded DNA. It also works out the uncertainty of every variable, including the uncertainty of the data peaks themselves. So here you see a computer pattern that might say, well, suppose there's a lot of a first genotype at 13, 14, and there's less of a second contributor shown in green, and even less of a third contributor shown in orange, and it puts, relative to the data, it puts all that pattern right on top of it, and adding up all the alleles, again with other factors like stutter, it explains the data very well. Well, that explanation and those underlying genotypes would receive a high likelihood and more probability. The computer's also trying out hypotheses where the alleles are not where you may see the data. It's not quite independent, but it's moving them all over. It may take the genotype from the first contributor, that's a major contributor, and say, what if it's a 10, 11, and there's nothing covering 13, 14? That doesn't explain the data very well. We get almost zero probability. So the computer goes through this 100,000 cycles, exploring hundreds of variables each cycle, and tries out different patterns. And the variable we care about is the genotypes. And those genotypes that better explain the data end up with higher probability. So for example, here is a genotype that would be computed for each contributor at every locus. So for this one locus, for the second contributor shown in green, you get a listing of allele pairs. Everything's shown visually, but for this presentation, I'm just showing you a list. And associated with each allele pair, like 16, 18, would be a probability, like 65%. All DNA mixture methods have underlying probabilities, even the allele-based methods like CPI. But what TrueAllele can do, because it's scrutinizing the data so much, is to put more probability on more likely allele pairs instead of spreading the likelihood equally over all allele pairs. And so more probability is concentrated of those explanations that better explain the data. So here you would have a probability distribution, say 65%, 10, 12%. The numbers, when they're all done, add up to around 99 or 100%, because that's what probability is. It's the extent of belief that you have about different explanations with numbers that add up to 100%. The nice thing about probability is that likelihood ratios, which are a powerful form of DNA match statistic, work very well with the genotype probabilities. In fact, they were designed for them back in the 1930s with ABO blood grouping. And here we see the likelihood ratio. So just think of them as a match statistic that describes the information. The logarithm of the likelihood ratio, which is the exponent, the number of zeros after the 1, is a standard measure of information in many fields. So for example, in these 60 comparisons that were made between the evidence, 12 evidence items, and the 5 suspects, 7 matches were identified by computer. In the first row, the handgun matches the 5th suspect with a max score in the tens of thousands. There are 4 zeros, so a number 4 is in the table at the top right. The hat in the second row, the computer was able to separate into 2 individuals, the first suspect, the fifth suspect, and provide a max score in the thousands. That's the 3, a 1 followed by 3 zeros, and then the 4 number that you see on the right, again in the tens of thousands. Looking at this visually, we can see how the computer has mapped the crime scene of evidence to suspect in this county for this gang. There are 5 suspects. In red, the gang leader, indicated as S1, we see is tied to the hat mixture that was left at the food mart, shown in the west. The suspect 2, shown in green, is tied to the jewelry store robbery, having left some DNA on a counter. Suspect 5 is involved in 2 different crime scenes, both east and west, and his role in these crimes is much more hands-on, as you see from all the touch DNA that he's leaving with his hands on all the items that he's leaving behind at crime scenes. So this is a mapping of the crime scene, and then once there's DNA evidence and a lot of other evidence and witnesses, the case can go to trial, and then I or others report these results. We write a report, bring it to court, testify, and so on. There's a nice article about this process of why it's actually relatively easy to explain these methods and testify about them in court, and what the process is, preparing lawyers for cases and so on. It's described in this September Forensic Magazine, easy reporting of hard DNA, computer comfort in the courtroom, and you can pick up a copy in the exhibitor hall at the Forensic Magazine stand. Likelihood ratios have a bad reputation for being difficult to explain, but as I described in a presentation at this conference 2 years ago in a talk, and there's a conference paper about that, you can present these in plain English if the math is adjusted to give the same number but more understandably. So a statement like, a match between the evidence and the suspect is 12 trillion times more probable than coincidence. All those words in that sentence make sense to normal people like prosecutors, judges, juries, and defense attorneys, and it's perfectly accurate. There's no transposed conditional or any other weird stuff. TrueAllele is a reliable method, which we know because there are at least a dozen validation studies that are done, reports that have been written. There are 3 peer-reviewed papers so far. The most recent one, done with New York State, will be appearing in the Journal of Forensic Sciences next November. And let me briefly describe some of the results. Is the method sensitive? Does it detect perpetrators? Does it detect people who deposit their DNA? In this study, we divided the data, the 81 items, into 3 different mixture groups. Shown in blue are the simple cases that were largely easy 2-person mixtures, some with reference samples. In green are the intermediate cases, some 2- and 3-person mixtures, not so many reference samples, like known victims. And then the complex cases, shown in orange, are more complex. They're 2- and 3-person mixtures, very low-level data, and almost impossible for people to review. Shown in blue is a histogram. On the x-axis is the information content, the log of the likelihood ratio. The peak of that distribution is a little over 10 to the 15th, which is about a quadrillion. And the computer is getting reasonable match statistics by working with genotypes that it's inferred as opposed to alleles. With the intermediate samples shown in green, there's a shift to the left, but you still have an average max score of around 10 to the 12th, or a trillion, and then the more complex cases shift a little bit more to the left, but averaging maybe 1 billion or 10 million as a match statistic. Is the method specific? Do you identify the right people? In addition to identifying the right people, do you not identify the wrong people? And so we did a test of specificity by comparing the inferred genotypes from each case against all the references in the other 40 cases. And what we find, since you look on the x-axis, you see the information is negative. So for example, a negative 9 means that it's 1 over a billion. It's more likely to be coincidence than to be a specific person. Likelihood ratios can do that. They can quantify the extent of exclusion as well as inclusion. You see that on average, these cases, for the simple cases, are giving numbers like 10 to the negative 21st on average. And as the cases become more complex, it's still not misidentifying somebody. It's not saying that somebody is present who isn't. The method's also reproducible. It's a hard statistical problem involving many hundreds of dimensions, so it's solved by statistical sampling. Ranked from left to right are the cases, and the y-axis shows the information, the log LR. The typical values around 10 to the 15th across the cases, and you can see that as you move to max scores below 1 million to 1, there's more variation, but when you quantify it, it's still less than a factor of 10. So if taking what the computer did across these 87 matches from the 81 items and putting that in a blue background, we're still seeing the 81 items from left to right and the information value as an exponent on the y-axis. Now let's see what people did. So what happened with human review is that human review produced 4 RNP values shown in gray, which gave, so you assume that the major contributor is basically the only contributor and you get a good max score. There are also 8 CLR values that people could ascribe, and these had pretty good values because they use a victim reference. There were, the rest shown in orange are CPI values that all tend to be around 1 million to 1. And overall, for the 87 matches that the computer reported on, people reported on 25 of those matches. So 70% of the evidence matches did not get a match statistic. So the conclusion that you can draw from this slide is that computers tend to get a lot more information, and they tend to make better use of the data and may produce match statistics where people don't. So TrueAllele has been used in criminal trials. It's been used in over 100 case reports filed on DNA evidence. I and others have given court testimony in state, federal, military, and foreign courts on crimes that include armed robbery, child abduction, molestation, as well as murder, rape, terrorism, and weapons offenses. Usually these are crimes where a match statistic is needed, there's DNA evidence, and the lab is giving either a very low score or more often now says it's inconclusive, so a more thorough investigation of the genotypes for determining a match statistic is needed. TrueAllele has been around for a while. 10 years ago in Arizona, I gave the first live demo on a Macintosh showing it solve a mixture problem. And over the last 10 years, a lot has happened. The system's become very robust, highly validated, with hundreds of more variables added. I guess the major change is it spends most of its time working out how certain it is of its own results. How well does it know the answer of what it's producing and account for that by diffusing probability and having more conservative match statistics. A precedent was set in a case that I got involved with in 2009. This is the first case that I know of anywhere in the world where sophisticated computing was used to solve a mixture case. And the entire life cycle of the story through the published precedent of Commonwealth versus Foley that was published by the Pennsylvania Superior Court in February is on poster 96 downstairs if you want to take a look at that story. And it's abstracted from a book chapter I wrote. This case has a lot of wild elements. There have been documentaries about it, several books written, not about the DNA, just the case itself. It's full of amazing, salacious details, so people just can't help but, it's got everything in it: sex, death, police, it's just everything. Anyway, this led to the Superior Court decision, and there's now precedent in the state of Pennsylvania, which has made life certainly easier for the counties, including in Pittsburgh, where it's being used regularly. So what's the future of DNA evidence? As you may recall, in 2010, SWGDAM guidelines were released for mixture interpretation that basically, in a nuclear way, annihilated much of what was going on in crime labs before that time. There's not enough laughter, but you know what I'm saying. It was a wake-up call that complex DNA mixtures needed to be interpreted in a way that did account for data uncertainty, and older, less reliable methods of human review of mixtures were de-emphasized. It was the beginning of more reliable computer interpretation. More specifically, there's one paragraph, 3.2.2, that acknowledges the role of probabilistic genotyping methods, of which there are several, and implicitly the role of computers in solving these problems. We're also taking advantage of the sensitivity and specificity of TrueAllele by having genotype databases as opposed to allele databases. The databases you're used to from DNA index systems that you use regularly from government-provided databases are based on alleles, and depending on your lab, you may only be uploading 10 or 20% of the mixtures that you're finding, and certainly not the complex ones, because of the false positives of these association mechanisms, as described in an AFS talk that I'll show you where you can find everything at the end. And again, in the studies that we're doing, we're getting a complete separation of the sensitivity for finding criminals on a database and sensitivity for only finding the one person or no one if they're not there, instead of getting many different possibilities, like hundreds of names coming back. So in this system, every item gets uploaded, and if it finds something, you know about it, and it's real. And if it doesn't find something, then there's no valid LR match statistic that's that informative. So we're now in the TrueAllele computer age. We have an objective, reliable, truth-seeking tool, and it solves the DNA mixture problem. There isn't, it solves 5, 6 contributor mixtures. You obviously get more information if you only have 2, 3, or 4. It handles low copy and degraded DNA. The DNA match statistics are accurate and reproducible, and it automates the process. And today it's being used in labs on their own machines and on data sent to cybernetics, if you don't have a machine, to eliminate backlogs, reduce forensic costs, solve crimes, find criminals, convict them, free the innocent, and basically create a safer society. If you're interested in more information, our website has hundreds of hours of entertainment for you, of courses, newsletters. The newsroom describes recent cases. Presentations like this one are going to be up there. The slides are up there now, I'm pretty sure. And then the talks are there. And then a lot of publications, book chapters, validation studies, magazine articles, and so on. So thank you for your attention.